Very interesting work. And as I was visiting this page moments ago, I had a little notification here. I clicked on it, and look at this! From 3 hours ago! Our old friend Gordon reacted to your podcast episode, Abused Children Become Empaths. Hey! That's a good news. So here we go now with the other thing that Gordon told me about. Gordon sent me an email saying, hey, you've talked about Switch to Birth before. Oh, boy. And he sent me a link to one of the actresses, which we'll look at in a moment. But this is my original review from 2013 of Switch to Birth. I'm trying to put the link in chat. Switch to Birth. And it was an interesting show based on babies that were switched at birth and deaf kids in hearing families and other ways around, and we're all a big family together. And it was sort of interesting. And this is the website that Gordon sent me. And this is one of the actresses in Switch to Birth. And gosh, 10 years later, she's older now. She's aged. Not being critical, just being observant. Because in the show, she had a very minor role. And she always played the angry deaf person. Because she was one of the few people in a show about deaf people who was actually deaf. And she has a new show. So we support that. Her name is Stephanie Nagaris, a talented Puerto Rican actress who was born profoundly deaf. Now, Jenna hates that. She said, look, you're born deaf or born hard of hearing. But Jana says that hearing people love saying profoundly deaf. Inevitably deaf. How dare they not be deaf? The deaf. Those deaf people. Profoundly deaf. Janice says, just say deaf. So this is a very nice conversational piece about her as a deaf performer. Great. I love what she does. It's a wonderful interview. But it triggered me, and triggered is the nice new woke thing where you get all upset about something. And what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do about it. We're going to get into it. And it doesn't have anything to do with Stephanie. She's very wonderful and completely and totally appropriate. This is the problem. Katie Leclerc. And she's this actress here on the left. She was in Switch to Birth. And this is the other actress on the right. Switch to Birth. Okay. Now. I don't even know when is this from? 2011. Okay. So it's around the time Switch to Birth was going on. Katie Leclerc gives voice to deaf community on Switched. Okay, now, hey. This gets very deep and very personal for me. Because Katie Leclerc played on Switch to Birth a deaf person. Katie Leclerc, while she was born with some hearing loss and says that she has Meniere's disease, she does not identify as a deaf person. She has very clearly said she identifies culturally, educationally, intellectually as a hearing person. And the thing that really brought this home for me was maybe a year ago during the pandemic, Jan and I were hooked on watching these Lifetime movies. I even wrote a blog article about it, how to write a Lifetime murder mystery. And Katie was in several of them. And she was a hearing person. She did not have what they call deaf speech or impaired speech. She was just this regular, gorgeous, fun, warm person who was not profoundly deaf. And I asked Jen, I said, she's switched at birth, right? Yeah, switched at birth. I bet she's not. I thought she was deaf. And Jen said, no, she's not deaf. I said, what? And then I sort of remembered. Oh, right. She's not deaf. And here is where it gets just a little bit terrible. From this article, that's a promotional article. Anyone who watches Switched at Birth might think Katie Leclerc is deaf, profoundly deaf. The actress stars as Daphne Vasquez in the ABC family drama Tonight at 9. Daphne lost her hearing as a child due to meningitis. Leclerc plays the role with a deaf accent and also signs all of her lines. In real life, the Lakewood, Colorado native has Meniere's disease, a rare inner ear disorder that can impair a person's hearing and sense of balance. But she's able to hear and performed her first audition for the role on Switched at Birth as a deaf character with no accent. Once she landed the part, she worked closely with both a dialect coach, a profoundly deaf dialect, and her older sister, who has suffered hearing loss due to Meniere's, to perfect the part. I sat down with the producers early on and we talked about the accent. And we mapped out Daphne's hearing loss and focused on sounds she would be able to say and sounds that she wouldn't, as a profoundly not deaf person. Leclerc told the Herald recently from Los Angeles, I worked on it every single day and made my family and my boyfriend absolutely crazy because I was talking like a deaf person. Deaf viewers have responded positively. That I don't believe. Not for 1 second. I don't believe you. Everyone that I've spoken with has been so happy. I think that comes from a place where this is really the first time they've been represented in a great, general, respectable, awesome sort of way. Well, aren't you special? Change.org. Replace Katie Leclerc with a deaf actress who knows ASL. Blackface and yellowface are no longer acceptable. They are tenets of racism America largely pretends we have never engaged in. We now have a new form of racism like this on television. Autism. I've written about it before in both blogs. Autism in the form of Switched at Birth. Katie Leclerc, a.k.a. Daphne, for those of you deaf, big D, small deaf people who don't know, I didn't until my friends told me how disgusting and cruel it was and embarrassing, adopts a deaf accent for her role in Switched at Birth. Katie Leclerc is not deaf. She has a hearing loss that fluctuates. But she does not identify as a deaf person. She does not identify as big D deaf either. She does not identify culturally as a hard of hearing person. Katie/Daphne has an abominable grasp of American Sign Language as a deaf character. There is nothing about Daphne that brings about the verisimilitude of a young, deaf woman. And then it goes on and makes the case for why Katie Leclerc is a big phony. And she is a big phony. And if you do a little bit of research, you're going to find people who say, oh no, she's a great actress. That's what actresses do. They play things they are not. And she has a disease, so she has every right to play that character. Even though she's faking an accent and she's working with speech therapists so she can sound more deaf. And this now brings us into the larger picture, the more in-depth conversation that's really important to have. In the theater, let's say, and television, there has been a long history of non-traditional casting, which I don't always understand because I'm not a very bright person. And yes, the theater is very forward-pressing, and there are a lot of woke people in the theater, and there have been. So this idea of non-traditional casting. So Gordon says, are you maybe giving the new show a chance? I'm not even talking about the new show. Great, I love the new show. So the idea historically of non-traditional casting is, if a script is written by, let's say, white people with white characters, why not non-traditionally cast a black character in that white role? That's the idea of non-traditional casting. That even though something may be written this way historically, you can insert other people into that. Okay, now, intellectually, that makes sense. Logically, it makes sense. Culturally, in context, does it make sense? I would say, let's say, The Iceman Cometh by Eugene O'Neill. Story of a white immigrant Irish family. Now, there are those purveyors who would say, oh no, you can cast The Iceman Cometh with non-traditional character actors. Asian, black, put a woman in for a man. Okay, you can. And it will be different, it will be interesting. But is that the realm of the show? Are you being honest and truthful to the character of the show? Now, Samuel Beckett defended his work very stringently. There were people who wanted to take Waiting for Godot and set it in a subway with homeless people. And he said, no, that's not my show. You can't do it. And he denied their production. Later, people say, well, when he dies and his brother dies, we're going to be able to do these shows however we want, and we can cast whoever we want. Okay. Now, the people who say, let's say, Iceman Cometh, replacing Irish characters, the traditional Irish family, with other people of different cultures and different races and skin color, that's fine. This is where I ask my next question. Let's say you're doing the history of slavery in America. You're doing another version of Roots, Alex Haley's Roots. And traditionally, those characters have been played by black actors because, hey, it's a story about black repression and black slavery. Now, if you're going to try to have it that non-traditional casting applies everywhere and all the time, what is your answer when somebody raises their hand and says, hey, let's get really interesting and cast Roots with white actors from Ireland? Is that appropriate? Does that tell the story in context? Now, certainly you can do it. You can be interesting. It's an interesting take on something. But is that appropriate? Well, it's non-traditional casting. Well, you could do white slaves. You could do Asians and the slavery and the internment camps of World War II. You can do all of that. And justify it in some woke, forward-thinking way. But is it being truthful to the original context of what, let's say, Alex Haley wrote in Roots? When he wrote Roots, the history of slavery in America, did he mean for white Irish people to come in and play those roles? I say probably not. And I would say that black actors would say white people have taken our roles for years. It's our turn now, which I understand. But if you support non-traditional casting, where are you drawing your lines between what's acceptable as replacement casting and what is not acceptable as replacement casting? Gordon says it's kind of like how some people protested The Little Mermaid being portrayed by anyone other than a young woman with A4 paper skin tone and lobster red hair is unacceptable. Very interesting. And the idea now in New York and with the Dramatists Guild is if you happen to be a white male, you are supposed to include in your contracts that people of color who work on your show needed to be included in your show in some sort of ratio. Now that is inclusion. It makes sense. It should be voluntary. I don't know if it should be mandated and required. But that's how things start happening. You integrate the army by demanding and requiring that people of certain races get promoted at certain times. But it makes it hard to defend that universally when you make exceptions to some rules and you deny other people other rules. So now we circle back to the question is, disabled people in television and on shows, do they need to be played by disabled people? Because traditionally they have not. Gordon says, and remember the cursed child controversy on Broadway when the role of Hermione, which people associate with the Harry Potter films, a young white actress, and cast her with a black actress. I do not remember that. But very, very, very interesting. That's what we're talking about. So we had Daniel Day-Lewis, genius actor, playing Christy Brown in My Left Foot. He is not disabled. We had a Stephen Hawking movie played by Redmayne, right? Eddie Redmayne is his name? Not disabled. Traditionally in film and Broadway, The Miracle Worker, Helen Keller, not played by a disabled actress. Now, I admit that having a deaf and blind actress on Broadway or in a movie would be very difficult to make happen, just logistically and in real time. Because communication would be very challenging to make happen. You could certainly do it, but it'll take more time and more money. However, you could have a deaf actress play Helen Keller, sort of deaf, sort of, maybe, hearing impaired, eyesight impaired, maybe, a little bit. How much? I don't know. Is just being deaf enough to play Helen Keller? There are some people who will say no. There are some people, I think, who would like to have a blood test if you were, playing a black actor in a traditional black role. Are you black enough? Or is your skin too light? The paper bag test. Oh, she's not really black. Her parents are white. She's just a little bit black. Is that enough? I don't know. Can you just put in a male to play a female role? And there have been people who say, look, men should not be allowed to write women roles in books because they don't understand women. Now that I've never agreed with, never really understood it because that shows a lack of thinking and imagination on the part of the author. You're saying that a white male can not write a black woman character because you haven't lived that life. Well, that I don't think works because you're discounting the idea of imagination. But in performance, does it change? Is there a different standard for something that is written and something that is then performed? Moby Dick should never be written unless you're actually a person who is a whaler. You can't write a story about the president because you've never been the president. You can't even imagine it. Now, when you start disregarding imagination, thought, creativity, then you're in trouble. Because then it just becomes a ridiculous stand against common sense. Writers can imagine things, artists can imagine things. Our friend Gordon says, brilliant writer David E. Kelley, who made shows like Ally McBeal, recently said that if the show was to be rebooted, he would want a woman to be the showrunner, to be more in touch with what the female lead characters experienced and felt. That's very interesting. But is that in some way condescending? Is that in some way playing to the woke crowd? That a man can't relate to a woman. That only a woman can relate to a woman. That only a black character can play a black character. That only a disabled person can play a disabled person. And if it's up to me, I say, look, man and woman, equal talent. Do the right thing. Let the person who has the least opportunity take over the role, whether you're male or female, or the job. And I think now today that with the Americans with Disabilities Act and more mainstreaming of disabled people in society, when it comes to playing a disabled role, I would always prefer to pick a disabled actor of some type if the character itself is disabled. Often writers will take their scripts and book drafts and run them by people who have experience in the field in question, Gordon says. Show someone who perhaps was the president, or even show a woman your book and say, is this okay? And that's one way of doing it. But then you're asking for their personal prejudices to influence your stream and your ideas and your thoughts. If James Joyce had used that for Ulysses, I'm not sure we would have a book called Ulysses, because it would be destroyed by committee. But that's the safe way to do it, try to get consensus. And a couple of months ago on this live stream, there was a study about working in groups, and collaboration is big in the theater, collaboration is big in name only in movies and television. And it was, if you agreed with the group, then you were seen as a positive and interesting person and acceptable. If, however, you offered criticism, even if it was right and constructive criticism, you were seen as being outside the circle of understanding. And your ideas, even if they were good, were not accepted because you were being critical. And I thought that whole thing was funny. Because if you're not being the outsider, giving some feedback that hasn't been thought of before, then what good is being in a group if everyone's just going to agree by default to get along so no one's mad at each other? But that's how things are working now. That's how progress is not being made in the workplace, in the theater, and in entertainment, because people are too worried now about offending other people and getting locked out. So must male roles be played by male people? I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I guess it depends. Should they just say, The Shape of Water, I've talked about that before. That's the actress, the main actress in that, who is, I guess they would say, does not speak. Some people would say mute, does not speak, has her own language, was played by a able-bodied, able-voiced actress. And she had a history because she's that sort of type, odd-looking, odd-behaving, that mainstream Hollywood thinks is, oh gosh, she'd play a great disabled person. And she sort of made her career playing people who have disabilities, even though she has no disability. Now, The Shape of Water, if they had put in a deaf actress, an actress who is truly, does not speak, does not use a voice, it would have been so much more interesting. And maybe that's me being woke. Maybe that's me being too far ahead with an agenda. But I think that it's changed so much today that the expectation is, even from 10 years ago, was switched at birth, that in that situation, in that context, a deaf person should be playing a deaf character. Just like today, and in that change.org petition, said we don't do yellowface anymore. We don't put people in blackface and have them play black characters. We don't have hearing people play deaf characters. But even in institutions, hearing people who, maybe know a little bit of sign language, they're put on a list. This person knows how to communicate in sign language. And the deaf people raised their hand and said, this hearing person does not know ASL. They're not fluent. Well, they know enough to say hello and goodbye. That's enough to put on the list. Makes us look good as a company. Or you have an ASL program where every person on the faculty who teaches is deaf. And then the program is run by a hearing person, because the department doesn't want to have to deal with a deaf person. They worry about interpreters and understanding and misunderstandings. Let's just get a hearing person who maybe happens to know some sign language and have them deal with the deaf people. It's really very insulting. And sometimes you have to stand up and fight back and lose in order to win. And that's my rant so far today. Thank you so much for Commissioner Gordon for pulling the trigger. And now we got to take a break. We will be back in a moment.